Hi, I'm Laura and I am the Action Research Lead for Project 2 at Tameside College. We did an action research project with the research aim of how can developing teacher feedback and encouraging a growth mindset with post-16 maths research students enable them to justify their answers in the classroom. I was joined with colleagues from Tameside along with colleagues from Hopwood Hall and the Trafford College group. And we followed 3 cycles of action research, starting with looking at AO3 resources, which then led on to growth mindset strategies, and finally looking at teacher feedback. The literature review focused on 6 key themes, which when combined would support students to answer AO3 style questions. Literature around AO3 criteria showed just how important AO3 style questions are, as they actually make up around 25% of the questions in the GCSE maths exam. So it showed how crucial it was that our learners could master the skills required to answer these questions. Research on working with peers revealed how group work can help to improve learner motivation when implemented in a well-structured learning environment, as the students help each other as it's in their own interest to do so, and therefore their effort increases. Literature based on teacher feedback showed that giving a student a grade will prevent the student from reading the comments required to make progress, as those with a good grade felt that they didn't need to read the comments, and those with a bad grade didn't want to read them. So we decided to focus on our research aim, as during the tag process it became apparent that students struggled to answer AO3 style questions, preventing some students from meeting their target grade. So we wanted to look at how we could adapt the structure of a GCSE maths research lesson to allow learners time to focus on resources which included AO3 questions. Also, we decided that if a student can successfully explain why they've done something to their peers, it shows that they've got a full understanding of the question and can increase their confidence. So we decided to look at 3 peer work strategies, which would help learners to move from a fixed to a growth mindset so they could be more confident in answering AO3 style questions. As learners often become demoralised by bad grades in assessments, we wanted to see how teacher feedback could be improved so that the learners would take on board their feedback to enable them to make progress. So, what did we do? The first cycle of action research, we focused on AO3 resources. The resources we created focused on key GCSE topics such as ratio, fractions, decimals, and percentages. We actually changed the structure of our 2-hour lesson so that 1 hour was spent working on the new resources and the second hour was spent on new learning. The resources had a heavy focus on AO3 style questions, and they were based on the previous week's new learning section, so the students had to recall what they had learned the week before. The resources were delivered by teachers across the Action Research Group over a 4-week period, and then we moved on to Cycle 2, which focused on 3 growth mindset strategies. The first strategy was a card sorting activity where the students had to sort a series of cards into either growth or fixed mindset phrases. For strategy 2, the students were given 2 AO3 questions back from an assessment that they had recently completed. 1 question which they'd scored well on, and 1 question that they'd either skipped or not picked up many marks on. The students then had to explain to their peers how they broke the question down that they'd scored well on without giving their peers the answer. For strategy 3, the students were given a past exam paper. We used a paper from a different exam board just so it was a fresh set of questions that the students hadn't seen before. The students then had to go through that paper and colour code it as either green, amber or red. So the green questions were questions that were in the students' comfort zone, questions that the students were comfortable in answering and they'd practiced many times before. The questions that they highlighted as amber were in the students' growth zone, so they were questions that they weren't quite sure how to complete but they were keen to learn how. And finally, the questions that they colour-coded as red were in the students' anxiety zone, so they were questions that they really didn't know how to complete and would not attempt them in an exam or assessment. They then spent the remainder of that lesson focusing on questions that they'd labelled in their growth zone, and they helped each other to answer those questions and break them down. For the final cycle of action research, we looked at teacher feedback, and the students were given back an assessment that they'd completed but with no grade or score. Feedback was provided throughout the assessment with how the students could make progress. The students had to read through those comments and decide on 5 topics to focus their revision on over a series of 5 weeks. They were then set Maths Watch homework on each of those topics, and they had to complete 1 homework per week. The following week's lesson, a question that the student had either got wrong in the homework or they skipped completely, was printed out for them to work on with their peers as a starter activity to close the feedback loop. Throughout the project, we used the following research methods. So at the start of cycle 1, we used an initial student survey. 446 participants actually completed this questionnaire on the online platform SurveyMonkey, which looks at AO3 questions and learner mindset. At the end of cycle 1, a teacher focus group was used to see the effectiveness of the AO3 resources. So 4 participants were invited for a focus group after the resources had been delivered over a 4-week period. During cycle 2, student observations were used, so 4 participants were observed whilst completing the 3 growth mindset strategies. And for cycle 3, the students were invited to an interview at the end of the cycle. So 5 participants took part in interviews to share their thoughts and research on the research conducted during cycle 3 on teacher feedback. Analysed data for cycle 1. Qualitative data from the initial student survey was coded into themes to draw conclusions from the results. Participants in the teacher focus group gave consent for the focus group to be recorded and transcribed and coded into the following themes: effects of the pandemic, challenges with the resources, student motivation, group work, and recommendations for the resources. For cycle 2, an observation schedule was created and each of the student observations were transcribed. The students' names were anonymised and student vignettes were used for the findings of each of the 3 growth mindset strategies. For cycle 3, again the participants consented to the interviews being recorded, so the responses could be anonymised and transcribed and student vignettes were used in the report. So, what can we now say? Findings from the initial student survey showed us that well over 70% of the participants agreed that the structure of their maths lesson needed to be changed to allow them more time to practice AO3 style questions. Findings from the teacher focus group showed that resources should have a focus on exam techniques and how to break exam questions down, with teacher A commenting that the resources work well when completing in pairs or small groups with an engaged class, but when you encourage group work with challenging groups, they easily become distracted and off task. Some students also just tell their peers their answers to the questions rather than explaining how to complete it. This then led us on to cycle 2 as we realised that students needed support in how to engage in group work effectively and how to break those exam questions down. Findings from strategy 1 showed us that encouraging a growth mindset through providing examples of positive phrases alone does not help a student to solve a mathematical problem. To help a student to thrive in the growth zone, maths should also be put into context that learners see the value of. When asked to explain a question to their peer and break it down, student B commented that they could not actually remember how they'd answered the question in the assessment. Certain methods they just knew how to do, but didn't know how to explain what they'd done. It was easy for them to just complete the question rather than explain it. So again, that showed us that these students still needed more support with how to break questions down. However, what was really interesting to observe was the change in behaviour of student B compared to when they completed strategy 2 when it came to strategy 3, as they explained how to answer the question step by step to their peer without giving them the answer, which was a skill that they really struggled with without the guidance of their teacher during strategy 2. So this was showing us that the more practice these students were getting at breaking down questions and working with peers, the more naturally it was coming to them. For cycle 3, when asked how a student felt about being given an assessment back with no grade, student H made the following comments. I really wanted to know what grade I got and I didn't really get why I couldn't have it, but as I read through the feedback I could see what I needed to work on, which was probably better than a grade. Creating a personalised revision plan helped the students to figure out which topics each of these questions were. So what we found was when they were creating the plan, they was asking their teacher what topic each one was. So they knew that that was a question that they struggled with, but didn't know if that was, for example, a ratio or a percentages question. So that lent itself to being able to answer AO3 questions, because part of the criteria is they need to make connections between different topics in maths. So this was a skill that they needed to develop to know how to make connections between the different topics. All 5 of the participants in the student interviews were in agreement that working with peers through their starter activity was useful, and student J shared that they actually felt good when they were able to explain how to do something to their peers. Through completing this action research project, we are able to make the following recommendations. We should encourage peer work with students when working on AL3 questions, as the students can help each other break down the questions. Guidance on working in groups for both teachers and students should be embedded into the curriculum from the start of the academic year so that students can engage in group work effectively. Students should be given feedback without grades initially so they can focus on the comments to make progress rather than being demoralised by a grade. And finally, the lesson structure for GCSE maths reset lessons should include time for students to read the feedback they've been given and act on the comments to make progress. Otherwise, feedback just becomes a tick box activity for teachers and it is not beneficial for the students.